Hello and welcome to FACT's webinar, Exploring H-2A Farm Workers. Our guest presenter is Chloe Faulkner-Johnson. I'm Catherine Hoke, FACT's Humane Farm Programming Assistant, and I'll be moderating this session. Thank you for joining us. Before we dive in, let me just take a minute or two to do a few quick introductions. Food Animal Concerns Trust, or FACT, is a national nonprofit organization that works to ensure that all food-producing animals are raised in a humane and healthy manner. We accomplish this by supporting humane farmers through our humane farming program, promoting policies that make food from animals safe and healthy to eat through our Safe and Healthy Foods program, and generally helps consumers make informed food choices. Our Fund a Farmer grant application and our mentorship program applications are now open. Please visit our website at foodanimalconcerns.org to learn more about all of our farmer services. At this time, I'm very pleased to introduce our esteemed presenter, Chloe Faulkner-Johnson. Chloe's work focuses on ensuring farmers and the agricultural community receive sharp legal analysis as she writes newsletter, books, guides, and supports curriculum development. Chloe farmed for many seasons, learning from many wonderful farmers. Chloe began her legal off-farm career as a public defender, providing legal services for low-income clients, and later developing equity programs for lawyers and court systems with a nonprofit in Raleigh, North Carolina. As an agricultural professional, Chloe has advised farmers on small business formation, zoning, and real estate issues. Chloe most recently worked at the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association as the local food systems manager. At CFSA, she led market access efforts and provided technical assistance to growers on GAP certification and the Food Safety Modernization Act. Chloe owns land with 4 friends in Cedar Grove, North Carolina, and is slowly turning a raw piece of land into a home site and a place to grow her food and flowers. We're very lucky to have Chloe and her wealth of knowledge with us today. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to you, Chloe.
Thanks. Thank you, Catherine. Let me get my slides up. All right. Okay, so today we're talking about the H-2A program, some legal obligations that are inherent in that, and some ethical considerations around having H-2A workers. Before we get into the meat of the program, I want to give you a small introduction to Farm Commons. Some of you may have come to some of our Farm Commons webinars that have been presented by FACT before, but if some of you may not be familiar with Farm Commons, so I want to give you a short introduction. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission is up here on the screen. It is to empower agricultural communities to address their own legal vulnerabilities within an ecosystem of support. And we at Farm Commons, along with all of the other organizations we collaborate with, form this ecosystem of support. We do it at Farm Commons by doing really extensive research and developing what we hope are plain language, easy to read, educational materials for farmers and ranchers on several different areas of the law. So the law is quite a big area, right? But farm law that we focus on is about business law. It's kind of the boring stuff that actually leads to resilient businesses over time. So we do programming on business formation and selection, like forming an LLC or corporation, farmland leases, food safety insurance, understanding zoning codes, property and crop insurance, and employment law. Those are our main areas of focus. We have a membership program, so a lot of our materials are only available to our members. FACT is a member of an institutional member of Farm Commons, and at the end, we'll have a coupon code for any of you who may be interested in joining Farm Commons as a producer member. We do not do individual legal services, or we only do that on a very limited basis. So we are an educational organization. we don't provide legal advice and we don't collect fees for providing legal services. And you heard about me. I'm Chloe. I am now the staff attorney at Farm Commons. And so I have to do a lot of that research and put together a lot of these materials. So let's get into what we're going to be talking about today. This is just a brief overview. We're going to first start with the purpose of the H-2A law and visa program. Then we'll jump into the legal obligations for people who are wanting to use the H-2A visa program. Then those ethical considerations, and we'll get to questions at the end. Okay, so first things first, we want to center on why the H-2A program exists. It is designed to bring temporary non-immigrant workers lawfully admitted to the U.S. to perform temporary or seasonal agricultural labor or services. The workers that come on H-2A visas are only approved if it has been demonstrated that the employer cannot find sufficient and willing qualified U.S. workers to perform the jobs. And the H-2A program is just one of many types of visas that allow foreign nationals to work in the U.S. So for example, there's an H-1B visa as well, which is for temporary academic and research positions when there's not enough qualified U.S. applicants for the role. And technology companies like Amazon or Microsoft employ folks on H-1A visas who bring more advanced skills around computer systems design. And more relevant to us, there's also an H-2B visa program that's specific for food processing. So we start with the purpose of the H-2A program because we want to keep this purpose in mind as we talk about the obligations and the things you have to go through in order to participate in the program. This purpose can sometimes offer a justification as to why there's so much paperwork or that requirement, for example, of proving that there aren't sufficient domestic workers. And there's going to be a lot of rules. So we want to really keep this purpose in mind. Okay, so farm labor, there is a scarcity here. It can be difficult to find workers that work long-term on farms. And that might be why a lot of you are here today to learn about the H-2A visa program. Quite possibly you're having a hard time recruiting workers and some of your operations might be hand intensive or working with animals. So we're going to help you out today to figure out specifically if the H-2A program is an option that could work for your farm. But before we get into how to leverage this opportunity, I want to start with some common misconceptions about the H-2A program. And we're going to address them first because they can cloud one's view of how the program works. And I want to tell you about some of the more difficult parts of the program up front because I don't want you to be waiting for me to talk about an H-2A program that doesn't even exist. Okay, so there's three things I want to bring out right up front. So number one is that H-2A is just a type of visa. It is literally the name of the visa that allows an individual worker to be eligible to work in the United States. It's not the name of an entire program that does all of the steps of the process. So it doesn't recruit workers or supply workers to any farm operation. When a farm employer is going through the process of securing the visa or the right to hire these workers, the workers in another country are also going through a different process of actually securing the visa and having interviews at the consulate. What this means is that farm operators need a separate an additional strategy to actually find the workers or the individuals in foreign countries who are qualified, willing, and able to travel to the United States for work on the farm. Now, farmers have a variety of means of finding workers uh, to do this recruitment process. I mean, it could be personal connections in a foreign country. You could work through an industry association who's built those connections. There's also individuals and businesses who do this service for a fee. So we're going to get to that in today's program, how folks end up finding workers for their H-2As program. But first, we're going to get into more details about how the program works and its legal mechanics. So on to number 2 of my 3 misconceptions about the H-2A program. If you've ever considered H-2A because you thought it might be a money-saving venture, I'm here to tell you the H-2A program is not cheap. In fact, farm business labor costs often rise when farmers start using the H-2A program. The H-2A program is designed to provide a solution to a shortage of domestic qualified workers, right? That's that purpose. It's not designed to manage the cost of labor for agricultural employers. There are a lot of additional regulatory expenses that are part of the H-2A program, including what is often going to be a higher minimum wage than what farms are currently paying non-H-2A workers. There's also a requirement to pay for the H-2A workers' transportation to and from their home country so they can get to the farm. And housing must be provided for H-2A workers. So all those obligations we're going to get into, but at this point, I just want to emphasize that H-2A is not a money-saving venture. But at the same time, many farms end up being quite fine with the higher labor costs and all the extra regulatory costs because, of course, without labor, crops and livestock are never going to get to market at all. And they do a cost benefit analysis. And for many farms, it does end up working out economically in the end. Okay, for that third point. And this gets to the ethical considerations that we'll talk about later, but human trafficking is real and is somewhat rampant throughout the H-2A system. So the H-2A visa program provides a lot of opportunities for farmers and for workers, but it creates a tremendous vulnerability as well, and we have to acknowledge that. It's just indisputable that the H-2A visa program is a significant avenue for human trafficking. Violations of the regulations requiring fair and safe working conditions are really common. And an important point is that sometimes farmers themselves don't even realize that the workers that are coming to their farms are being bought and sold, forced into slavery, or having their wages stolen, and receiving housing or work opportunities that are different than what were described to them. Since 2017, 9 federal lawsuits in North Carolina, where I am, that allege abuse of the H-2A program have been filed. So these were things, the complaints here were being underpaying the H-2A workers, forcing them to pay the transportation costs from their home country to the farm, and then threatening deportation if people fled adverse conditions. And there's been so many there was a huge operation in Georgia in 2021 called Operation Blooming Onion, where 21 individuals were indicted for all kinds of violations of the H-2A program. So this does happen. And even though it happens, we know that the vast majority of farmers are ethical employers and wouldn't stand for this kind of thing happening on their operations. And so later we'll talk about ways to detect and hopefully stop things like this from happening on your farm. And I don't want to give the wrong impression. It is very possible to use the H-2A program and be a highly ethical employer. in a situation where the jobs make your workers' lives better and the workers make your job easier. So that is quite possible. You just have to be aware of the risks. Okay, so those are the basics that I wanted to get out of the way right up front. Um, and if you're still with me, then you've passed the first test of whether the H-2A program might be a solution for you and your farm. So now we're going to talk about more of those legal obligations, what the process actually looks like. Okay, if you look at the official process of utilizing the H-2A program, you may find something that seems relatively simple because it's just, if you really boil it down, it's just 3 steps, right? You first submit a temporary labor certification application to the US Department of Labor. And then once that's approved, you submit a form that's called I-129, and that goes to the US Customs and Immigration Services. And then that form gets approved, and then your workers apply for their visa and or admission to the United States. And then they come to your farm and they work the season, and that's it. Okay. So basically there's just sounds like 2 forms to complete, and then the workers have to do their own forms about getting the visa. Doesn't sound too bad. Okay. But even though there's nothing incorrect about boiling it down to these 3 steps, just saying it's 3 steps in a couple forms is like saying filing farm taxes is really easy. Step 1, you fill out your Schedule F. And step 2, you complete your 1040. And step 3, you mail it, right? It's a lot more complicated than that, although those steps aren't untrue. So doing all of this, whether you're filing your taxes or you are applying to the H-2A program, your success really depends on your tolerance for reading complex and confusing instructions that come hand in hand with government forms. And then also having to maintain excellent detailed documentation of all of the things that are wrapped up in the process. So completing these forms, though there's just 2 of them, can require many hours of work. And you have to have all your ducks in a row. So things you have to have are job descriptions that you've posted for domestic workers as before going to the H-2A program. You have to have housing arrangements settled. You have to have your pay schedules, how much work they're going to have and for how long. All of this has to be set before you begin the H-2A application process. Now, in this webinar is not designed to tell you how to fill out these forms, but we are going to talk about what you need to have in place before you start completing these forms. And honestly, most farmers who go through the H-2A program use some sort of support service or maybe even an attorney to help complete these forms at the appropriate time and make sure you're going through all the steps of the process correctly. Some industry associations will have the services like this to help you get through the process. Okay, so now on to those legal obligations. I have broken it down to 3 slides here, and we're gonna go through them step by step. So the list that we give you though isn't 100% complete. There may be additional obligations that are true for your specific operation. This is a summary, and we can't outline all the contingencies that may occur, but this will give you a good idea of what is required. So first and foremost, very important piece, employers have to provide free housing to all their H-2A employees. Not only that, but the housing must be inspected and certified by all relevant regulatory authorities, which includes federal and then usually state and local certifications for residential housing as well. Now, oftentimes local zoning, there are farm worker exemptions to permitting in some of these certifications. So you're going to be on your own on that to figure out what you have to do locally. But I will say federally, what one thing we're very concerned with is OSHA, because what you would be providing if you had housing for your H-2A employees would be called a temporary labor camp. And you'll need to meet all of the obligations that OSHA requires for temporary labor camps. And Farm Commons has a guide. It's called the Farmer's Guide to In-Kind Wages. That talks about giving workers groceries and other amenities in place of wages, but it also talks about housing. And it goes through all the responsibilities of providing farm worker housing. And I can get you all a link to that if you want to read more about what will be required and what you would have to do if you did build or acquire housing for your H-2A workers. The second requirement is that employers must provide free daily transportation from this housing that you've acquired to the work sites. That is, of course, if those are different. So if the housing is right on the farm, they can just walk to work. But if you are renting out houses around the corner and it's too far to walk, they will need free daily transportation to get to and from the farm. And then also, the employers need to provide safe, insured transportation at least once a week to the workers so that they can go, essentially, so they can go grocery shopping and pick up any other incidentals that they may need. Like a Walmart would be a great place because they can get a variety of things there. But this has to happen once a week. You have to provide the transportation and it has to be free. Okay, on to the second slide of 3 obligations. Okay, we'll talk about food. So employers are required to provide free, convenient access to a kitchen and cooking facilities for meal preparation. So some of the housing will have this, some of it won't. And if it doesn't, you are required to provide 3 meals a day at a cost to the worker of no more than, okay, so the slide says $14 a day. That's an old amount. This year it is $15.88 a day. So it hasn't gone up that much. So what that means is you have to provide them 3 meals if you don't provide them access to a kitchen or cooking facilities, but that you can take $15.88 a day out of their paycheck for the cost of those meals. So those are pretty cheap meals, but you get to decide if it's worth it to give them a kitchen or just provide the meals. Okay. Employers must also cover the cost of travel, food, and lodging from their home country. I've mentioned this, to the place of employment along with their return trip back home. And the employer is also required to pay for all visa fees needed for an H-2A employee to work in the US. Okay, so there's one more slide to go of I think 3 more obligations, right? But I'm going to pause here to recognize that this is already a lot of obligations and these aren't owed to domestic workers. I want to get us really thinking about why this may be. So H-2A workers are in a very different situation than our domestic workers. H-2A workers, when they come to the country, generally haven't been here before. And if they have, it's through the H-2A program, so they have a very limited understanding of the country. They are likely not going to be able to be licensed drivers in the US. They're not going to be familiar with the cities, the towns, the shopping stores. They may not be familiar with the language. And they're going to need a lot of support connecting with any resources. All of these factors make these workers extremely vulnerable, and the law attempts to recognize that. And that's why the law requires the employers who sponsor them to provide so much support and structure for their stay. Okay, so moving right along, we have 3 more legal obligations here, and this goes to wage, So first off, you have to pay your H-2A workers a certain wage. So there is the federally set adverse effect wage rate, or AEWR. You'll see that in many places. So that is one option. But if the prevailing wage or the local, state, or municipalities minimum wage is higher, then you have to pay that wage. So the AEWR, or the prevailing wage, can change annually. So each year, the calculation needs to be done. And you can really fairly easily Google the latest AEWR rates, make sure you're getting the most recent ones. For example, this year in North Carolina, the AEWR is 15.81 an hour. So that can increase minimum wage rates above what farmers are currently paying. And once you pay the once you pay your H-2A workers the required rate, you then also have to offer that same amount to your domestic workers. So it often raises labor costs across the board for farm employers. Okay, for H-2A workers, you also have to carry workers' compensation insurance that covers H-2A workers. So these premiums are going to vary greatly depending on the nature of the work you assign and its injury risk level, and where you are. So this one's a really hard one to estimate as to how much it would be. But workers' comp can be a good investment for you and your workers. And if you don't currently have workers' compensation, Farm Commons has a guide called the Farmer's Guide to Hiring Obligations, which goes into details about workers' compensation, how it benefits farm owners and not just the employees. And it has some tips on how to manage premium costs. So I'll get you that link as well. At the end of the session. So the last obligation here goes to the requirement. Okay, so there has to be a work contract. Remember I said you have to have your pay schedule and the number of hours and how long the workers will be with you for the season all laid out before you submit your application. All of this has to go into a work contract, which is going to outline the total hours for the H-2A workers for the season and the wages you'll pay. Now, the thing is, sometimes seasons get cut short, things go wrong, but with H-2A workers, you are locked in for at least 75% of the total wages promised in the contract. That's whether or not the H-2A worker can complete the hours, no matter what happens. And again, this goes back to the vulnerable position H-2A workers are in compared to domestic workers. So if the farm season ends early or there isn't enough work and there's a domestic worker, that person can simply get another job, right? They can go to Walmart, Starbucks, anywhere. They can get another job, or so the theory goes. But an H-2A worker is legally not allowed to get another job anywhere. If the job ends, then they have to travel back to their home country to get another job. So that's a lot of lost time and money. So there's this requirement that at least 75% of the work contract has to be paid, even if the work can't be completed. And you are not allowed to collect fees like the job application fees or the service fees from the workers as a way of recovering your costs of providing any of these things, workers' comp insurance or travel to and from the home country or the visa fees, right? This all has to come from the employer. I did mention you can charge those very limited fees for food if you provide those 3 meals a day. And there are some allowances for you to be able to charge for daily travel. But really the big ticket items are going to be the responsibility of the employing farm. Okay, so many farmers They look at these costs and they assess them, and they decide they are comfortable providing all this to H-2A workers, and it's worth it. Of course, there's other farmers that are not going to be able to secure all these things. And success with the H-2A program often depends on access to resources. I mean, some farmers are lucky and they have suitable housing nearby, maybe just affordable homes around the corner. Um, and then there's a convenient, big box store for shopping that's really close. So it's not going to be difficult to meet all of these obligations just logistically. But other farmers are really far from affordable housing, and the prospect of building their own farm worker housing just really isn't on the table. Um, some communities are going to have more transportation options or ride services that are going to make these weekly obligations easier. But a lot of farms are going to be in rural areas where it's just going to be up to the farmer to figure out how to get that done. So, some farmers are in tricky situations, but they're still happy to provide all this, or they're in a position to be able to. Maybe they only need a few workers and they already had housing on site. That's kind of an ideal situation, right? But it's really just dependent on what farmers have access to, whether or not this program makes sense for them. And so now we're at a checkpoint, and Catherine, you can run that poll now. I want to ask you all who are here these two questions, and just to kind of get a sense of where you all are at about whether or not, after hearing these legal obligations, if the H-2A program seems like it might be working for you. Because we've gone through a lot of the basic character of the program. And we're going to transition now into more of the ethical considerations. I'm just curious, where you all are, what you're all feeling after hearing all this. So if you answer yes, I feel like maybe I am in a pretty good position. I do want to keep exploring the H-2A visa program more deeply. That's great. And we are going to get into now how you find workers and how do you avoid human trafficking. But even if you're not seeing H-2A, at least in the short term, as a solution for you and your farm, you may want to stick around because eventually it may become an option for your farm if you scale up or other things change, and you want to be prepared. So it looks like I've got results now. The vast majority of people are having difficulty securing domestic workers for their farm. And most of you are just not sure if you're in a position to meet the legal obligations we've discussed. So that makes sense. Let's keep talking about them in a little more detail.
Chloe, I have a question really quickly. Can you share, can two different farms share workers?
Oh, that's a good question. I believe that is possible, but I do know that if it's not in the contract, you're not allowed to send H-2A workers to a different farm. That's prohibited. I'm going to have to look into whether two farms can do a joint application.
But that just might make it more affordable if
Right,
you could sort of
right.
get a couple of farms together, especially if they have different crops or different seasons.
Yeah, and it would also be a good way to maybe fill in gaps in the season, right? Keep them employed for long enough to make it make sense for the program. You could share housing costs, but I'll get you a definitive answer on that. I just don't want to answer it incorrectly.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so how do you find workers if you are interested in this program? So traditionally, farmers turn towards industry associations. So there might be a industry of tree fruit growers that have already established some ties about how to recruit farmers from other countries. They'll have networks to connect their members to resources as well that assist with applying for the H-2A program. Which can mean, just having services who help you fill out the forms that help you find the workers. But some services go so far as providing, I mentioned this before, but providing housing and transportation from the home country, or maybe even during the work period. So there's a lot of options out there about getting some of these needs met. Folks can also turn to what are called sometimes H-2A LC, or labor contractors. You might also heard the term farm labor contractors, or FLCs. These are businesses that recruit farm workers for a fee, obviously. And they can help with the paperwork, regulatory obligations, and communication with the candidates. And increasingly, we've seen a lot of FLCs taking on additional parts of the worker administration, like even paying wages or making travel arrangements, paying for the tickets for workers to get to the US. Some even hire workers themselves and then lease those workers to farm operations. And they can go so far as to handle the issues of housing, meals, kitchen equipment, all those kinds of things. But the process of recruiting and hiring is highly regulated, and you need to make sure that your hires are offered clear and complete information about the job they're about to accept, in terms of the tasks that are going to be assigned, the location, the pay provided, and all that information has to be in a language they can understand, which may not be Spanish or English. Some people coming on an H-2A visa may only speak an indigenous language, and you're still required to provide the information in their native tongue. So hiring H-2A workers is also going to affect how you treat and work with your domestic workers. So there are several obligations built into the H-2A visa administration that are designed to ensure that the program does not degrade opportunities for domestic workers to secure work in agriculture, right? The purpose is not to displace domestic workers. They want to supplement them. So they have to put in a lot of protections. So note that as part of the visa application process, you'll be required to do several things to continue recruiting domestic workers. Positions need to be posted with specific state agencies so that they can kind of prove to themselves that you are trying to recruit domestically. And the job descriptions have to follow specific standards. And you have to advertise the job description for domestic workers, but you are also obligated to hire any qualified, eligible US worker who applies for your job opportunity. So that's people with the required degree or experience level. And that's the case not just after the work begins, but until at least 50% of the work period is passed. US workers must be hired at the same hourly wage and with the same benefits as are provided to the H-2A workers if you have both classifications of workers. If workers are laid off at some point during the season, like the season ends early, H-2A workers have to be laid off first, even though, remember, there's that 75% fulfillment of the contract that's required. So you may still have to pay, even if the season ends early, they have to be laid off first, but you may still have to pay them on their contract, even if the work ends. Okay, so that's a lot. There are a lot of obligations in this program. And I have to let you know, you need to bear in mind that the rules can and do change with this program. With increasing usage, and I think we'll continue to have challenges in our domestic labor market. The visa program is getting attention, both good and bad. So you definitely want to keep an eye out for changes. So either way, if you're just waiting to see if the program is right for you, or you're about to jump right into it. This is another good reason to connect with industry associations or people who are familiar with the H-2A program to try to stay abreast of what is happening. I mean, there was a new rule that was just became in effect in June that is now currently under an injunction in 17 states. One of the biggest changes was that it allowed H-2A workers to unionize. But we don't know what's going to happen with that in the future. And very likely in the next few years, some H-2A regulations may change. So continue to keep your finger on the pulse of the H-2A rules if you're interested in the program. Okay. The reality is abuse within the H-2A program is around every corner. And anyone who uses this program should know about when and how abuse occurs. I don't believe anyone thinks, forced, coerced, or slave labor is acceptable, but it does happen to H-2A visa holders. And with the increasing usage of the program, I'm expecting to see some increases in abuses as well. So first, let's connect on a shared definition of trafficking. When a person is exploited for another person's financial gain through the threat of force, coercion, or fraud, that's what I'm saying human trafficking is. And it deprives people of their ability to make their basic life choices about where they want to live and what they want to do for work. So when this trafficking and exploitation benefit farm businesses, we all have to start considering our ethical obligations alongside our legal obligations. I'm not thinking I need to convince anyone here in this room about this, but I do want to make sure everyone's taking seriously this ethical problem, and to make sure that you all have all the information you need to be able to follow your own moral compass if you were to apply to the program. So I'm going to tell you a story about how this abuse often emerges, and this is through a person we'll call Santana. This is an alias, but the story is real and is based on some things that happen in Wisconsin for H-2A visa holders who were in dairy and vegetable production. So Santana lived in Honduras, where he struggled to earn enough money to make ends meet. And one day, a man tells him, hey, you can get a decent job in the US on a farm. And Santana is really interested. He asks a few questions and tries to make sure this move is right for him. He's wondering how long the job will last, what the pay is, and what the nature of the work is. Now, Santana has a health injury. He has to avoid bending down because of his back. But he's told this opportunity is fruit harvesting. You'll be upright. And Santana develops a good relationship with the contractor he's been working with. He provides him a written contract. He helps him book his travel. And the contractor also even shows Santana how to open a bank account in the US. So the whole process goes through. Santana gets to the US. The farm and the farm owners seem fine. They don't speak Santana's native language, but the contractor and his colleagues help translate. And, things are fine. Santana is making money. He's sending back most of his wages back home to help his family build a house. But then after a few months, the work begins to change. He's assigned to stoop to weed cabbages. And right away, Santana says, hey, this isn't what I signed up for. I have these health concerns. And the contractor starts changing his tune and begins to ignore Santana and just tells him to get back to work. Santana threatens to quit, but the contractor tells him he'll be seized by authorities and thrown in detention if you quit, right? You can't be in this country without your H-2A visa. And that may be true. Santana does the work for a few weeks, but the pain becomes unbearable. He doesn't know how to get to a doctor, and he doesn't have any money to pay a doctor or insurance to go to the doctor anyway. So Santana is really in a bad situation, and he tells the contractor, hey, I have to quit. I can't keep doing this. But the contractor says, quitting's not an option. You have to keep working. Santana persists and says he needs a ticket back home. And some of this is through text message, and the contractor texts him and says, he actually threatens people back in Honduras, his family back in Honduras, says, we'll have someone set fire to your grandmother's house. So of course, this motivates Santana to try to keep working. But he talks with his coworkers about maybe we could find some of our own work here together. But the contractor catches wind of those talks, pulls Santana aside, and demands a quarter of his paycheck, or he gives him more threats as to what will happen if he doesn't pay the contractor. So Santana at this point is just trying to get back to Honduras by himself, and he's looking for his papers. But the contractor was so nice at the beginning and handled all the paperwork and actually still has his visa and all his documentation. So now Santana is just can't go home. His body is hurting. He's being extorted. And he's afraid that if he does anything about it, the contractor will follow through on his threats to hurt his family. And in this situation, the farmer every day is coming out into the field. He smiles at everyone. Of course, can't speak the language that Santana speaks, so they're not having conversations, but the farmer gives instructions, and Santana gets to work. And the farmer thinks everything is going fine. Farmer knows he's providing free housing, decent pay, and a ride to town every week, and just doesn't understand what could be wrong. And obviously the contractor isn't sharing any of what's wrong with the farmer. So as a farmer, and as it did happen in this situation, these things can happen right under your nose. You can be a really kind of moral person and still not see this happen on your farm. But the good thing is you can reduce this risk. And the best thing you can do to prevent human trafficking and protect the freedom of those who work for you is not to use farm labor contractors. If you do the recruiting yourself and you develop the connections necessary to make contact with communities and people that want to work under the H-2A visa, then you're in control of all aspects of it. A lot of farmers do this, and it does take a lot of work to forge those connections. Oftentimes you can do it through past or current workers or church networks or those industry associations. But it can be worth it because, as you can see in the story of Santana, bad things happened because farm labor contractors, they have a lot of control over the worker. Wage theft and assault, all these things, they happen all the time with H-2A. The other thing you can do is, if you do want to work with a farm labor contractor, obviously do your due diligence as much as you can to make sure it's a reputable FLC. But also consider not giving over control of payment of wages or housing to the farm labor contractor, so that you have more control over those really important parts of the farm worker's life. Now, especially if you don't speak the native language of the workers that come, you are going to be dependent on the honesty and integrity of those people around you that do. So if that's a contractor who's translating for you or other colleagues, often it's just going to be best if you're able to communicate with the workers that you bring on to ensure that they are safe and being paid honestly. So if you can do any number of those things, you are actually really significantly reducing the risk of human trafficking. And with that, that's all we have for you today. I think we've been going for about an hour. I want to get you that this is just information about Farm Commons. We have a lot of good resources. I have 2 resources that I need to get links to you guys, Catherine and Samantha, so that you can pass those on if people are interested. I also want to give the producers that have joined us today this coupon code. If you are interested in becoming a member of Farm Commons, you can get 30% off. It's $99 for the year. So take 30% off of that. And you can look through all of our resources. And I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you guys. Any questions that you may have, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. And while you're formulating those questions, I'm gonna run a quick poll.
So Chloe, I have a couple of questions while people are thinking and putting their questions in the Q&A. What if you have an H-2A worker that's really just not working out for you, and you just personality wise isn't working out? Can you fire them, or are you committed to them? So what if they show up drunk or whatever? Like it's obviously it's on them, not on you. What can you do about that?
Well, my understanding is that you're still committed to that 75% of the contract. I mean, it is an interesting question about if they're showing up drunk. I'll have to look into if there's any exceptions. I haven't heard of any exceptions to that.
And we've got some friends of ours. They have quite a large wholesale grass nursery, and they hire about 23 to 25 H-2A workers a year. And they used one of those farm labor consult, whatever it was called, the FLC or whatever. But
Yeah.
and they have different package options that you can choose from. And the one that they do all the housing, but this company provides the transportation and actually takes them. They dealt with everything getting them to the US. They helped do all the paperwork. They helped do all that. But then the nursery actually pays them directly. But they had their own rules. So one of them was no drinking. They're not allowed to drink. And two of them was forcibly sent home last year because they were found drunk. So that's why I had that.
Yeah, it's the best way to come up with questions, like real problems.
Doesn't look like we have any Q&A. We don't even have any chats. I wonder if people actually, oh, there is. Okay. I can see it. There's one in there.
Yeah, we just have one question in the chat right now, which is WOOF a broker or is it a different type of program? And I'm assuming that's what does WOOF stand for? The
Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farms.
Yes, that's
yeah. So that's a very different program than the H-2A visa program. Sometimes people who WOOF with farms have to have visas, right? But they're usually here just on a travel visa. It's not a work visa, and that's a whole nother topic about how for-profit farms should not be having volunteer or like legally volunteers or employees, and our farmers are obligated to provide all the employment protections that are required for employees. But that's the topic for another webinar. So WOOF is not part of the H-2A program, and WOOFers would not come on the H-2A visa.
All right. Got a question. If the crops the workers were coming to plant or harvest fail, can you have the workers do other work on your farm?
Right. So the work is supposed to be described in the work contract, and that is supposed to be the work that is provided over the term or the season. Many times the work does change and there isn't an issue, but like in the story of Santana, sometimes the worker is not capable of completing that work and then issues can arise. So technically it should be in the contract, all the variety of work that they may be engaging in.
Okay, and then in the chat, I don't understand this question from Sylvia. Maybe if you could rephrase, or maybe Chloe, you know what it's saying. Do you have the contractor's contact? No.
Oh, like do I have referrals for FLCs or
like a phone
names
number.
of yeah, and I don't they're going to be, they'll be local to you. There'll be some national, like you'll have to do your own research on those contractors. I know before the webinar, there were a couple questions that Samantha shared with me. And I'm remembering one of them off the top of my head was how long can H-2A workers stay? Okay, great. It looks like I guessed correctly on Sylvia's question. And that initially the term is for the one season, but H-2A workers can renew their visas up to 3 years. After they've been here for 3 years, they have to leave the country for at least 3 months and reapply to come back in. But typically what happens is folks come in for a season, they leave, and then they come back for the next season. And when it works out really well, they're connected with a farm that they come back to season after season after season.
Are there any government programs that help people navigate this H-2A program, or is this something that's strictly happening in like nonprofit spaces like Farm Commons?
I don't know of any government programs that are providing any, services to help with the process. I think most of it now is just in the private industry, so for a fee.
So,
but those industry associations might have, I don't know locally what you may be able to find, but most of it is going to be for a fee.
So what about, you said that you sort of get inspected, or you there's all these requirements. Who inspects to make sure that you are doing the things you're supposed to be doing? Is there an auditing process, or is that, because I know a friend of mine, when she was living in California, she's a social worker, and that was her job. And I don't know if she worked for the county or the state or whatever, but she went around and she visited H-2A or migrant housing to make sure that they had the right housing, that they weren't being trafficked and they weren't being taken advantage of. And so that was what she did, like at the beginning of her career. And is that sort of more, would you expect to find that in every state, or was that just sort of a program out there in California?
It sounds to me like she worked for an advocacy organization that had gotten funding to do that. There's no one single H-2A inspection program, right? OSHA would go in and inspect the farm worker housing initially to make sure that it meets the requirements of the temporary farm labor camps. And I don't know, actually, I don't know if they do annual inspections, but OSHA would have their own regime for inspecting the housing specifically. And then the Department of Labor is going to do investigations into like wage payment and making sure you're fulfilling the contract that you provided and all of those other things. And a lot of their investigations and the complaints they file against farms take years and years, right? So it's actually a variety of different federal agencies that are going to have a view into what happens on the farms. And it sounds like, yeah, a holistic inspection would be an advocacy organization.
Okay.
Doing the good work and trying to keep people safe.
Is there any limit to how many people you can bring in at a time? I'm sorry, Catherine, I talked over you. I'm really sorry.
A limit to how many? I've never heard of a limit to how many. You have to justify, you have to justify that you can support it financially and just with all the other support that you have to provide. But yeah, I haven't heard of upper cap or a lower cap. You can have one.
We've got a couple questions in the Q&A. Lisa asked, does the contract include specific crops or is it more generic?
That's a great question. And I'm not gonna be able to give a great answer to that. I can look into that and try to see how specific the contract has to be, but I actually haven't seen a lot of contracts, so I don't know how people typically address that.
And then any thoughts on how the election might affect this program?
Yeah, so that slide on when I was talking about keeping your pulse on the changes. It will definitely affect this program. I don't know in which ways. I imagine that the protections, what was it called? The Farm Worker Protection Final Rule that was just effective in June will probably um, not survive for much longer. So like I said, that gave protection against H-2A workers being retaliated against for organizing in a union. And also ensured that advocacy organizations could come in and visit workers and did some other things. But so I think what we might see is a little bit of reduction in farm worker protections over the next 4 years, but then the next 4 years, they might come back. Potentially some reduction in that AEWR, but minimum wages are increasing. And in many states, well, not many, in a few states, the exemption, as I'm sure you all are aware, but exemptions for farm workers from minimum wage are being removed in some states. So again, if your state minimum wage is higher than the AEWR, you have to pay that anyway.
I think that's the last question we have in here. And oh, we just had one more pop in. Do you have a moment to one more
Sure.
question? Could a contract be written to include all potential tasks during whatever time frame needed, even if one may not necessarily do them if everything goes well in a season?
Yes, I assume, and this is another specific contract question that I can't answer with 100% confidence, but I would just say generally when you're writing things that, right, it needs to be fulfilled, you want to write it as broadly as possible so that you can, I mean, in this case, so that you could ask them to do any number of things on the farm. You know, if it gets too broad, that may impact the application or the people who want to fulfill that contract. But I will look a little more into the kind of ins and outs of the contract and see if I can give you guys a little more context via email, and Samantha can share that with the participants.
Great. Well, with that, yeah, I'd love to thank Chloe for a wonderful presentation, and thank you to everybody who has attended. I've just a little bit of housekeeping to share before we sign off today. A recording of this webinar and a link to the slides will be available probably within the next day. That will be emailed to you. And then these documents will be archived on our website. We also have other great webinars coming up. We have, I think, just 3 more the rest of this year, but we've got really great topics. So check out our website to register for those. So sincere thank you to Chloe. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, everybody enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Samantha and Catherine.
Bye. Thank you, Chloe.